Public transportation is a part of daily life for millions, a routine journey from one point to another. But for some, these ordinary rides can take a terrifying turn into the unknown. Late at night, on nearly empty buses, the line between normal and nightmarish can blur, leaving passengers with stories they'll never forget. From unsettling encounters to unexplainable events, these true stories will make you think twice the next time you board a late-night bus. This happened when I was a 21-year-old college student in Washington state. To save a little on gas money, I'd take the 9 p.m. bus from campus back to my apartment every Friday evening. The ride was usually predictable and quiet, shared with a few other exhausted students and people getting off late shifts. It was a familiar, mundane routine. But one particular Friday night was different. When I stepped onto the bus, a strange chill ran down my spine. The bus was completely empty, eerily so, except for one solitary figure. He was seated in the very last row, and the moment I got on, his eyes locked onto mine. He stared at me directly, an unnerving intensity in his gaze. His clothes were ragged and dirty, as if he'd been sleeping outdoors, and his long, matted hair hung over his face, obscuring some of his features. I immediately felt uncomfortable and tried to avoid his stare, quickly choosing a seat in the middle of the bus, putting as much distance between us as possible. I put in my headphones, hoping to just disappear into my own world. About 10 minutes into the ride, a sound broke through my music. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me. I cautiously turned my head. My heart jumped into my throat. The man was no longer in the back row. He had moved up and was now just 2 rows behind me. A wide, unsettling smile spread across his face as our eyes met again. "Do you remember me?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. Confused and a bit scared, I shook my head and told him no, I didn't. He leaned forward, his smile never wavering, and whispered, "You should." A wave of panic washed over me. I tried to move seats, hoping to create more space, but he mirrored my every move, following me again and sliding into the row directly behind my new spot. The space between us felt suffocating. I could hear his breathing. It was loud, shaky, and had an almost hungry quality to it. It was the sound of a predator. Desperate, I looked toward the front of the bus, trying to get the driver's attention, but he was completely focused on the dark, winding road ahead. Then, the man whispered something that sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins, freezing every muscle in my body. "I sat behind you last week too, and you didn't even notice." The thing was, I hadn't taken the bus the previous Friday. I had gotten a ride from a friend. My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but there was no logical explanation. Suddenly, before I could process it, the man reached forward and violently grabbed a handful of my hoodie, his grip surprisingly strong. I let out a scream, calling for the driver. The bus screeched to a halt, lurching forward. The driver, finally alerted, turned and yelled at the man to get off. The man slowly stood up, but instead of running off in a hurry, he turned, pointed a grimy finger directly at me, and said with chilling certainty, "You'll remember me next time." Then, he calmly walked off the bus and disappeared into the thick, dark woods that lined the side of the road. There was no next time for me. I never rode that bus again, and to this day, the memory of his voice and his promise still haunts me. I used to work late nights in downtown Chicago, a job that often had me catching the final bus of the night at 12:40 a.m. The route was a long one, winding its way through some deserted and quiet industrial areas before reaching my neighborhood. It was a journey I made countless times, usually lost in thought or music. One particularly cold winter night, I found myself as the only passenger on the bus. The city lights faded behind us as we moved into the darker, more desolate parts of the route. At the third stop, the bus doors hissed open, but no one was there. Nobody stepped on. The driver waited a moment, then closed the doors and continued on his way. I was staring out the window at the passing, empty warehouses when a movement inside the bus caught my eye. And that's when I saw her, a young girl, who couldn't have been more than 13, was sitting in a seat across the aisle from me. She hadn't been there a moment ago. I would have seen her walk in. The bus was silent, and I was the only one on it. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, far too thin for the freezing winter weather. Her face was turned away from me, pressed against the window, and she was completely, unnaturally still. A feeling of deep unease settled in my stomach. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet bus. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch. It was as if I hadn't spoken at all. The bus driver must have noticed my nervousness through his rearview mirror. "You see her too?" he asked, his voice low and grave. My stomach dropped. The question implied this wasn't the first time she had appeared. "What do you mean?" I asked, my own voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer, just kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I knew I had to do something. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead, with the intention of checking if she was breathing, if she was real. As I got closer, my own reflection appeared in the dark window she was staring out of, but hers didn't. She had no reflection. There was just the empty seat and the dark landscape rushing by. I stumbled backward in shock, letting out a choked cry and yelling for the driver to stop the bus. He slammed on the brakes, and the sudden stop caused the interior lights to flicker violently. For a moment, we were plunged into darkness, when the lights flickered back on just a second later. The girl was gone. The seat across the aisle was empty. The bus driver turned in his seat, his face pale, and leaned toward me. He spoke quietly, his words heavy with a warning that felt ancient. "Don't take this bus after midnight. Not on this route." I didn't need to be told twice. I quit that job a week later. I still take public transit, but I make sure I'm home long before the clock strikes 12. I never want to see that girl again. Back in 2022, I had to travel from Nevada to Northern California for a work assignment. The most convenient option was an overnight, 6-hour bus ride. I boarded around 11 p.m., ready to get some sleep, and found a window seat near the middle of the coach. Shortly after, a tall man wearing a heavy, dark coat sat down in the seat directly across the aisle from me. He never said a single word as he settled in, but he immediately began to stare at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an unmoving, unblinking stare, like a statue fixed in my direction. I tried to ignore it, telling myself he was just socially awkward or tired. I put on my headphones and tried to drift off to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I was startled awake by a persistent, rhythmic scratching sound. I opened my eyes, disoriented, and my blood ran cold. The man had moved. He was no longer in the seat directly across from me. He had taken the one diagonally in front, much closer now. and he was dragging his fingernails slowly and deliberately down the metal support pole next to his seat. Sko. The sound grated on my nerves, but what was truly terrifying was his eyes. They were still locked on me, and he wasn't blinking. Not even once. His gaze was intense and predatory. I whispered, my voice barely audible. Sir, are you okay? His head swiveled toward me in a stiff and natural, jerky motion, like a marionette being pulled by strings. Then he smiled. It was the most horrifying smile I have ever seen him possibly wide, stretching his face into a grotesque mask. His lips moved, and he mouthed something at me, but no sound came out. I couldn't understand what he was trying to say, but the sheer malevolence in his expression was enough. I had to get away. I scrambled out of my seat and walked as quietly and quickly as I could toward the front of the bus to speak to the driver. Behind me, I heard footsteps. He was following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the driver and told him in a panicked whisper that a man was acting strangely and scaring me. The driver, seeing my distress, pulled the bus over at a small, deserted rest stop and turned on all the interior lights. We both turned to look, but the man was gone. He wasn't in his seat. He wasn't anywhere on the bus. The driver opened the door and we looked outside. The ground was covered in a fresh layer of snow, but there were no footprints leading away from the bus. He had simply vanished. Confused, the driver went to check his passenger list. He scanned it, then frowned, looking back at me with a puzzled expression. No one was assigned to that seat, he said. In fact, no one sat across from you. You bought the last ticket for this route. I stayed awake for the rest of the 6-hour ride, my eyes wide, staring into the darkness. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. I don't know who or what rode with me on that bus through the dead of night.